which is kind of nice. It sounds really fancy, but it's completely not. So, but it's just a nice view. But with the view comes snow, so we do get snow. Sometimes I wish I was in the Finger Lakes, because those were the two places when I moved to New York that I wanted to live, either in Eden or the Finger Lakes. So I don't know if I chose correctly or not. So it's good to be here. I do a lot of speaking. I'm unfortunately, I think I was home 4 days this month. Family doesn't like that, but I love forage, and I love talking about forage. I love producer meetings, and I love doing work on farms with farms, because to me, the whole idea is for us to all work together to try to make everything the best we can. It all starts with forage quality, ends with forage quality. Question, how many guys milking cows? Wow, good job. That's awesome. I love that. How important is forage quality? I don't have knives to give out. I have a pen, but I probably used it. So, but how important is forage quality? Very. Why is that?
Because it has so much to do with the cost and the production.
That's exactly right. And it's been like that for years. I do talks in Canada too, and with their quota, it's interesting, they think they make great forage. But with the quota, they don't have to make as good a forage. And I noticed when looking at the New York numbers versus the Ontario or Quebec numbers, that we're on the bit a little bit more than what they are, just because we have to make good forage. They have to make good forage too, but yet they're chasing different things than what we are. So to me, forage quality is really important. And kind of the emphasis of this first talk, because you're going to hear unfortunately or fortunately, you're going to hear the same guy after lunch too. So don't blame me for the guy after lunch. And it's not Sean, by the way. But we did some work with an association with Cornell and King's. I did kind of the mycotoxin part because I'm supposedly known as the mold guy, which I don't know if that's a compliment at all. But so Rod, can you explain a little bit about what we did with that, with the plot?
Yeah, so there actually was a whole set of different studies at Cornell Dairy Farm that we were involved in the whole group. Our focus was looking at hybrid population interaction. So we planted 8 different hybrids at 4 different populations each, looking at yield, quality, and mycotoxin.
Yep. How important is planning population for corn silage, for example? Is population important? Do we use variable populations depending on our soil type? Do we even look at the population suggestions on the bag? Yes, no, maybe? Do we actually take the advice from our supplier and say, okay, well, what should we plant it at? And they say, well, you plant it at this, the top part of it. If it's 28 to 32,000, 32,000 will work, just blanketly throw it at 32. And that's fine for certain situations, but I think the more I start to look and really dial into forage quality and tonnage and starch and digestibility and mycotoxins, there is certain ground. Does everyone have princess ground? Does everyone have perfect ground? There's always that rough ground that we've had corn on forever, or it's just been a grass field for 50 years, and we don't, do much with it except for raise it. But there are certain soil types that are more conducive to lower populations, especially if we have varieties that are more flexy. And some of the reasons I love working with Kings is because I love working with the seed corn lines that they're working with. I've seen really good success with the Redtail and Kingfisher lines, and I know that there are fixed varieties out there and there are flex varieties out there, and obviously we know what flex varieties are. At least if we don't, we'll talk about it real quick. If we go through the field and there's a big skip and we see a plant there and the ear's like this, everyone says, man, I wish the whole field looked like this, right? We always think that. Or we go to certain situations where there's, where everything's crowded together. We had planting issues, and, the stalk's probably like this, and the ears are like this. And we're like, oh, this is frustrating. There's a farm that I went to, I shouldn't sell it, I guess I'll tell it. way, way, way north in Vermont. And they have a neighbor that's custom planting for them, and they like the neighbor because he's been there forever. He's planted dad's corn, grandpa's corn, 70 years old, has a new planter, like state-of-the-art, expensive planter. And they said, well, boy, don't you love all these new bells and whistles and all this precision? And he's like, I don't even know what the stuff does. I just go. And he has a problem where he goes. When he goes, he's got a cloud of dust behind him. We know what that's like. So he's got that cloud of dust behind him, seeds all over the place, planters bouncing all over. Anybody ever seen that? Probably some of us have done it, to race in front of the rain. But, so we started looking, and he was planting a BMR corn silage. And the last couple of years, honestly, the last 3 years, things haven't been as good as we liked. Looking at the quality and tonnage, and we started investigating a little bit more, started looking at stands and counts, and you'd go in there and there would be huge skips, and then there would be 8 plants like right here. And it'd just be all over the place. So I talked to a seed supplier and said, well, we got to work on this, and talked to the dairyman, and he said, well, it's our neighbor, and So anyways, long story short, they started doing stand counts, and at minimum, their plant population was 17,000. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? See, I hear laughs. That's good. So it gets better. 17's great. At worst, it was 55. Good stuff, huh? So how good was that corn, and how stressed was that plant at 55,000? Especially like a BMR or a flexier variety. I don't care if it's BMR or not. But if you stress that out and you crowd it, that's going to stress that plant and cause a lot of issues. So that's part of the problem. So forage quality, there's a lot of things that go into forage quality. We're not going to beat Mother Nature typically, but I think if we know our farms and some of the things that I work with, and we'll talk about a little bit more before lunch and after lunch, there are certain things that we can do to kind of work with Mother Nature a little bit more, and I think that's important. Because when you work against it, not many good things happen typically. So we can't control the weather, but there's a lot of things we can control. We can control day length on our crop. One of the biggest things that I do is when I go to farms, we start looking at their playing field for their forages. And most places I go, we're 5 to 10 days too long on corn, as a general rule, but some places are right on. I never see anybody that's way short on day length typically. But day length is critical because we can control that. We can control plant population, which we'll talk a lot about today, I think. We can control harvest dry matter. That's my thing. I love working with farms to try to get their harvest dry matter right. Because if we make corn too wet, we don't get any starch. If we make corn too dry, we don't get as much. We get a little bit less fiber digestibility, but less starch digestibility, and we all know inherently that dry corn doesn't feed real well. Sean, would you agree? What's your cutoff for corn silage dry matter, where you think things start to get wonky? Beautiful. It's perfect. It looks okay on paper, right? But cows will tell us it doesn't work real well. So these things we can really work on, obviously. Processing score is super important, especially if we're flirting with trying to get our corn silage at 36 to 38 dry matter. It's really important to get it processed. We don't want to feed turkeys, and that's what we typically do if we're trying to wash down the parlor or whatever, or we see corn everywhere. We don't like that. Packing density, if we have bunkers, bags, or silos, it's obviously important. I do a lot of drone work with inventory stuff now, and we're actually physically figuring out inventory with silage bunks now, and packing density is so important. There's farms that I go to where you can basically, it's like breeding a cow. You could dig into the bunk and basically be an arm's length into the bunk by the time you're doing that. If you can take a pencil or a pen, this used pen that I was going to give out, if you take this used pen and you can jam it into your bunk and basically not find your pen anymore, you probably need to pack a little bit more. Smaller farms don't have as much of an issue typically. it just depends on, we're bringing in feed way quicker a lot of times than what we're packing for. But variety is the last one that I have on here. To me, it's important, but there are a lot of other considerations that make those varieties better. So if you think about silage, we want to make the best corn silage we can because the majority of our diets are silage, or corn silage, I would say. But digestibility is typically made for fiber when the plant pops out of the ground to when she tassels. She's, kind of almost like a grass. So digestibility is set right there. So how you stress that plant, or the plant stress that sees, it's going to change your digestibility. Now, most conventional varieties are all within a certain slot. BMRs are over here because they're lower in lignin. I don't even treat them the same as what I would consider conventional corn silage. But we can tweak our corn silage, especially with population, to get our digestibility to kind of tweak either way. And the same thing, it's just basically what kind of plant stress we're getting at certain parts of the plant's life, and weather is still pretty much in charge. So like I said, kind of what I was just talking about is I do a lot of this corn silage analytics and harvest analytics just so we can figure out certain ways to make things better. So I say here, there'll be a few football analogies here, so I apologize for that. If you don't like football, that's okay. But don't outkick your coverage. Don't plant too long of a population or too high of a population, and don't plant too long a day corn, because there's a lot of research out there that shows that if you plant longer than what your signature is for your farm, typically you're going to be fighting. We know what happens in the fall. Does anything good happen in October for corn silage? Not much. And and you keep going, and what happens is you fight mud. And obviously when you look at the growing degree days for corn, it's not like it's still going like that. We get to the end of August and she flattens out pretty quick. So if you have 10 days longer, you're always hoping that ear is going to finish. Last 2 years we've been okay with that because we didn't get a frost this year until late, but we've been finishing a lot better, but that's luck. And Dave, you probably see it in your situations too, both Daves, I should say, for that matter. We had a great growing season this year. We could get away with longer day corn somewhat. And I always hear people, I think we should try longer day corn. I mean, do you hear people say that sometimes or not? Yeah. So you hear it because, it happened once in 100 years, so we can get away with it every year. Right, yeah, and it's that farmer, it's the farm mentality, and trust me, I get it, I'm from one, so I understand completely. So this is a really critical part. So this is part of that plot, and apologize for all the blinding numbers, but I'll break it down, and I kind of highlighted that as much as I could. So the plot went from 93 days to 107 days, a mixture of red tail corn and Master's Choice. And I highlighted a few things in here. The highest tonnage corn was the 93 day. And I'm not telling everyone in this room to go out and buy 43T because that's the one that's going to harvest, because that guy up there said, oh yeah, that's going to get the most tonnage. When you look at the plot, or you look at any plot, or you look at any information, I highlight this all the time. Harvest dry matter. Starch is really important and really critical. And when you look at a lot of situations, starch is highest here because the corn was 37 dry matter. She was finishing. The kernels were hardening up enough, and they pull that plant with it, and we'll talk more about that. So that affects tonnage in a huge way, and I know what happens when September 20th rolls around. We start shaking, right, because we want to jump on the chopper and go. But we waited 4 months or planted 4 or 5 months to try to harvest this beautiful crop that's going to get us through the next year and a half. But what we do is we get all nervous and we chop 5 days too early and ruin the whole thing in 5 days. It doesn't happen all the time, but we need to start and consider that a little bit more. So that's why it's really important. So when you look at these numbers, you'll see down here there's certain varieties that, like this 107-day variety, right here, really, it loved this year's plot for that individual field. It just loved it completely. And now this 107 day is a really good variety. I've seen it in Wisconsin. I've seen it in Indiana, Ohio, all over the place. It's a good variety. So look at this, is looking more at tonnage again. Notice the trend, 93 day, 95 day were kind of the harvest tonnage leaders. But I would preface this with saying that the corns were kind of sitting in the dry matter that they were ready. If you look down here at some of these 29 and 29 dry matter corn silage, I would suggest that we're probably 10 days off for that. And those, probably this 57T, probably, or 54T, which is a variety that I love. And every company has good varieties, but there are certain varieties that stick out. And, you know, I've done a lot of plots on various farms, and there were certain varieties that from different companies that I always used, and it seems like there's one or two varieties that always really work. And that one really works well if you can plant it. But, you know, 28.6 dry matter, she's not going to beat something that's 37 because the starch isn't done yet. So there's a lot of things to look at. Everybody's probably seen these before. I'm not a huge fan of these. Milk per acre is right here. Milk per ton is right here. A lot of times, if you talk to different people, everybody wants to get fancy with their people want to find the one that's up in this quadrant, which is the highest milk per acre and the highest milk per ton. This is the kind of the neighborhood you want to be in. So this does tell some of the story right here. Even though this one was the highest yielding, this one was by far the most digestible. So normally, just to give you a reference, like BMR corn silage, for example, when you look at these types of plots, BMR corn silage is normally down in that range. But, you know, 57T really did a nice job in quality and, for the most part, quantity too. So I'll skip through this because this is busy. But it basically talks about, and we can talk about this at some point, they basically took, oops, sorry, I got to go backwards. They took from 2016 to 2020 a bunch of different varieties of corn, lots of companies, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of samples here. The important thing is they're looking at 80 to 85 day corn, 85 to 90 day corn, and so on. They look at 5-day intervals. And if you're harvesting a 90-day corn at 36 dry matter, and you harvest a 95-day corn at that same dry matter, typically if you go up five growing degree days but can harvest it at the same dry matter, you're going to get more tonnage. But what happens is we often, if we plant too long a day corn, it's not going to finish. So even though it may look taller, a lot of times it's one of those kinds where we're chopping through the field and it's huge corn, but the chopper just rolls right through, and we're like pushing it to go a little bit faster. And then we get some of that squatty corn. You know, that corn you look at and you're like, eh. But then the chopper's telling us exactly what's going on. She's growling like crazy because of that. So those situations are types that we look at. So I think these are important things to look at. When you look at this 95-day, Dave and I were talking about this at dinner last night, that 95-day, there's a lot of great corns at 95 that can outproduce a lot of higher day corns just because of the way genetics are and how much focus we've put on these types of varieties. But let me see here. So this shows corn harvested at somewhat the proper dry matter to corn that was chopped way too wet. And if you look, if you go up in day length, see this silage yield? If you keep going in day length and make wetter and wetter corn, tonnage is going to go like this. And that's just something to remember with that. So what we know is ear dry matter is really important. So actually I chip a lot of corn for farms. I carry a chipper around in my truck, so I'm that weird guy that drives around with a chipper on the back of his truck. And I look at a lot of this stuff, and I'm starting to do ear dry matter now as opposed, well, I'm doing stalk too, but I'm pulling a lot of ears to kind of see where we are, because as we know, as the plant dries down, the kernels harden, dries down, and it's half the weight, 50 to 60% of the weight in the plant, and it starts yanking the rest of that plant with it. The stalk we know is wet, especially this season. You know how hard it was to try to get stalks down because we had such a good plant health year. But the ear drags that with you. And this is kind of the same thing. This was something I did in 2019. Basically, we've got dry matter and starch. So as starch increases, dry matter increases. Usually about that 33, 34 dry matter, you start to see a big separation where starch just starts to take off and then starts to yank the dry matter with it. If you're 30 dry matter corn silage, look at some of these forage samples. If you're 30 dry matter corn silage, you're usually 28 to 30 starch. Yes, sir.
Dry matter, do you measure it at field or
When I'm doing the harvest stuff,
yeah, when you're shipping it, you say this is the time to go based on shipper or based on the chopper or based on the farm?
I'm doing it based on that field at that time. So what I do is I take a look at, I find uniform as we can get, take 8 to 10 plants, chip it up, make sure it's uniform. It's not the end of the field, it's not the outside 12 rows, it's not the stuff that's on the hill, the knoll, or down in the valley, or next to the woods. You know, you try to take in uniform, so I get that dry matter, and I have an NIR machine that I use, because NIR machines now are really good. Normally we just send them to the lab, or we have to costrum and live our lives 45 minutes at a time to dry it down. So I've got an NIR machine that actually tracks starch and dry matter, so I can kind of triangulate where I can harvest. So if I know corn silage typically after 32 dry matter dries down at 0.5% a day, then I know by looking at that, if it's 30 dry matter today and the starch is starting to climb, then I know you're going to be, within 10 days you're going to be ready to chop. Now there's situations that change that. If we got blight situations going through, you got to walk the field. You can't just guess. So oftentimes I'll look at earliest planted corn, middle of the road corn, late planted corn. There's a couple farms that you probably know real well that I work with in Perry and Castile, and on a Sunday they say, hey, we've got 20 samples for you to look at today. So can you sequence our corn, which is fine, and we work on that. But yeah, that's what I do. I don't do it at the bunk, and I want to use chopper, but at the same time, it's as good as it is.
That's what I was thinking about. When I test it,
Yep.
what goes to chopper about 2.5.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's saying it's 2 points in the bottom.
Yeah.
That's why I was curious.
Correct. There's still that 1.5% difference, but I found that with the NIR machine that I get a lot closer, and I also grind it finer too. So there's a huge difference of, look at the lab, they grind our feed fine. We send it to them in a bag, and they basically measure it in a tablespoon. But it's ground super fine, so they can read it right. So what I like to do is my chipper is like a special chipper that really grinds it down, so the length of cut is really fine, so the NIR machine can read it accurately. So I get closer than what you typically would. But yeah, it's a great question. So this is busy. I don't mean it to be busy, but this is going to show you 5 days, September 12th to September 19th. On September 12th, that corn was 32 dry matter. Too wet or okay, or too dry? Anyone? Too wet? Too wet. So there's other things that go into that too, like how long it takes to chop, how many acres you have to go. So this isn't a static thing. So basically 5 days. In 5 days from September 12th to September 19th, we got 2.7 more tons per acre of corn silage. Who wouldn't want 2.7 more tons per acre? That 22 ton becomes 25, 26 ton corn silage then. Or that field that's 15 ton that we just want to get off because we don't want to see it anymore, we could add 18 ton. 4% more starch, the nutritionists like that. And then and obviously you're increasing the dry matter too. So a lot of it, you're not, at 30 dry matter, you're taking and chopping it and you're blowing everything through the chopper and it's going on the ground or running out of the bunk. We don't want to do that. So looking at ear differential, how many people still use milk line? Probably most everyone, you don't have to be embarrassed to use it. Everybody uses it. But I'm starting to see, and actually I'm going to be part of a Cornell trial this year, where we're looking at ear differential, because varieties, I'm seeing a difference when you look at milkline and actual ear dry matter and starch percentage. It's not created equal, even though we think it's created equal. So obviously this blue line here is the ear dry matter, and this orange line right here is the kernel starch, is basically the percent starch in our silage. So as that plant dries down and the kernels dry down, that starch goes like this, and we've all gone to the point, especially like this season, where ears got away from us. No matter how tight we got the processor down, we were passing some corn, and even on grain corn this year, because of the linear phase of the way corn grew, which I won't go into that, but you get into a certain point where corn really got hard, and we're even seeing that in grain corn and high moisture. That's why we love our fat tests that are higher than normal. Milk is okay, maybe down a touch. Muns are a little higher, maybe we can't get them down to where we normally get them down to, and we've tried to monkey with protein and can't get it down. Then it's typically a starch issue. The starch isn't as available in a lot of situations. Some places it is, but a lot of places it's not. So it drives us crazy trying to figure it out and harvest at the right time. So going back to the plot. So with flex varieties, if you plant at a lower population, you're going to get higher starch, and you're going to get more tonnage, and the stalks are going to be bigger. That's the whole thought process behind it. So with the plot, we planted most all varieties at 24,000, 28,000, 32,000, and 36,000. Certain varieties that are more fixed, they don't care what you plant them at because they're going to put on the same ear. But these flex ones really can change. So in this plot, what would you say between Master's Choice 5375 and 5663? What would you say the most distinct differences are between them?
5375 is more fixed ear, and 5663 is high flex.
Yeah. So in this situation, we had obviously the starch levels, went up as you went higher population, but then 5663, which is really flexy, at 24,000 we had much higher starch than we did at 36. She didn't like to be crowded. And why would you limit your starch if you can just lower the population? So it's really important to know your population and the type of corn that you have and the variety that you have. So this is really interesting to see. I was hoping that this would carry through the whole plot. And as you see, as dry matter goes up, starch goes up. Now when we look at digestibility, that's a little bit different. We all know digestibility is really important. And the average for the plot was 57, but if you look, the average for New York State or the Northeast for the last 10 years is basically 57 to 60, right in that range. So it was pretty much average, is what we would expect. Same field, 8 varieties, 52 NDFD 30 versus this one sample at 69. But you see some here up in the 60s and down. This shows how much variation, and that's from different varieties. These are the different populations for each variety. Now it could be hand harvest difference, there could be some variations to it, but it's interesting to note that on this plot for this season, if you look, all these in red and green for that matter, the ones in red were all that same one variety. It loved last season in that field. Not saying that's going to work in everybody's fields, but it loved last year in that, and that's what you're going to see. And then there's certain situations where you start getting down here, and I think we start to run into situations where we get maybe a little more plant stress. So when you look at hand harvested tons, dry matter tons, when you look down here, everybody asks, well, then how low can I go in plant population? So you look at this one right here, right here, right here, and right here. Especially when you're looking at 12 to 11 dry matter tons, and I think the average was 10.8 or 11.2 I think is where it was. But when you look at this, these 9s down here are 24, 24, 24, 24. So I'm not going to say this happens all the time, but in my experience and looking at this, Dave Stoner, is 24 okay or not?
Okay for me.
Yep. A lot of your guys are at 24?
No.
Is anybody there?
Yeah.
Not many though, right?
Yeah.
Where do you normally see guys at?
30, 32.
Yep. 28's probably the lowest on average you think people go? Yeah. And some, there are certain talks out there about, for example, like 54T, obviously the lower the population, you're going to get more, more quality out of the forage, and I won't argue that. In this situation, though, 24,000 didn't yield as much tons, but granted, the reason is these didn't finish either. So it's unfair to look at it this way because these were 29 and 28 dry matter. Corn wasn't ready. So that makes a huge difference where you look at over here, you look at this 43T, the variety averaged between 36 and 39, and just by fact, it was ready. So that's something that's really important to look at. When you look at any plot data, you look at any of this data, the first thing I look at is the dry matter. Because everybody's going to come in, every seed salesman's going to come in and say, hey, our corn won this plot. You should plant this. It was done in Iowa, but you should plant it here in New York. And you got to make sure you understand those numbers because a lot of that happens. I use Climate Smart Farming a lot. It's a program that I use. Well, go ahead.
I just want to back up a second there
Yes, sir. Oops.
on the population.
Yep.
Like you said early on, matching the hybrid to the conditions is important.
Yep.
This field where this trial was done was high fertility, going for high yield.
Yep.
We had ample moisture all season long.
No plant stress.
No stress.
Yep.
Lower fertility fields with stress, these results may be different. And we are planning to
Yep.
keep this study.
Yeah, no, and that's correct. And if I look at the growing degree days and the moisture for that individual plot, I look at the GPS code for that individual field and look at that growing season, it told me that 93 and 95 day corn should have been ready at that time, which if you look on paper, that 95 day corn said, yeah, this is exactly where I want to be. A week, 10 days later, could have been a completely different story, and actually it probably would have been a completely different story. So I use a website, it's free, called Climate Smart Farming. This is the growing degree days. What I do is I put the date the corn was planted. You can put your own individual address in. The date that the corn was planted, the harvest date is right here, and it tells you for that date the growing degree days that we've had for that season, and I'll call that your playing field. And you're using base 50 because corn is 5086. 15-year average, it shows you the 30-year average, it shows you the season to date. So actually we had 2,000 more growing degree, or 200 more growing degree days last year than our 15-year average. So we just had a warmer year. So it's just interesting to see how that worked. And then if you look at the chart, you can do this for all your corn or all your crops. Actually, I use it for every crop because these blue lines here are early frost. So if you want to know when your ground or when your zip code says you should probably be starting to plant, it'll show that. And then here, more importantly in New York, when you start looking at these dates right here, these are frost. You kind of want to make sure you know when your frost is coming. Because I have farms in New Hampshire that I work with that tell me that, well, we only plant 85-day corn anyways because that's all they can plant. They try to stretch it to 90 to 92, and they said, oh, we just let the frost dry it down. So then the dry matter's 48 or 45, and the starch is 28 because they're not in the right season. So you have to kind of know what your ground is going to give you and what the climate you're at is going to give you. So I try to take a look at these. This is that growing degree day chart that I did. Basically, I look from the day it was planted till the day it was harvested. I look at the moisture that we had. Typically on the mycotoxin side, which we'll get to here in a minute, if you get a lot of moisture right around tasseling, that's not a good thing. Because you're typically going to have higher DON issues when you have that, because you're going to have silk channel infections, and we can go into that a little bit more. I also use some NDVI technology, so in other words, the satellite will look down on the field and I can tell how healthy that field is due to the photosynthesis. It'll show how healthy it is. So green is really healthy. And it says December 14th, but it was May 18th, September 10th. So I use that a lot. I have this chart that I put together from a bunch of different people. Basically, it shows 80-day to 115-day corn. It shows the optimum silage harvest by growing degree days, even though growing degree days is only one piece of the picture or piece of the puzzle. This is to black layer. So if you look at if you open up a King's book and you look at a certain variety of corn, it'll say growing degree days to black layer. Does anyone in here want to chop corn silage at black layer? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Bad thing? Why is that a bad thing?
Your plant's dead.
Exactly right. Your plant is dead. And there's a lot of bad things with dead corn silage, right? Lots. So what I do to kind of help me get into the window, I tie things together. I go back here and I look at what my growing degree day average is for that field for the season that I'm planting. And then I go and I look at my corn, and I go look at a 95-day, so for example, a 95-day corn is around 2,500 growing degree days to black layer. I subtract 300 off of that, and that gets me into corn silage range at 32 to 36 dry matter. It's not perfect, but it's an idea, and it gets you somewhat close. So knowing that you're going to shave 300 off of this number, that's why I've got this little graph like it's set. But you subtract 300 days off of that because we're not chopping at black layer. And that's what I look at and try to hone in and dial in my corn silage for my farm. I don't care what my seed salesman says. I want it for my farm. Because he probably has a large territory and he probably does know the right time, but it's awful nice to take a look and see what the last 15 or 30 years tells us. So mycotoxins, so any other questions on the quality side? Sorry, I'm bouncing all over the place, but anybody have mycotoxins? Anybody heard of them? Okay. Anybody have had issues on farm where they think they were mycotoxin related? Anybody doesn't believe in mycotoxins? Yeah. Yeah, mycotoxins are a tough one. I love mycotoxins, and like I said, I think I said yesterday, people call me the mold guy, but that doesn't sound good, I don't think. And so I really, really love mycotoxins, and I like to try to find ways to outwork them. Our company does a good job with handling mycotoxins from a feed standpoint after we have the problem, but to me, even though I sell a product, I don't want to have it there to begin with. So to me, I've spent my last 4 years looking at how to control them more so than having to put something in there. And so we have a 37 plus test that basically checks for 54 mycotoxins, and it's liquid chromatography, mass specs, super expensive, super high-tech equipment. And then you get it in about a week, where I have a Raptor that I use on farm, where if you have a silage sample, if it's dried, if it's costered down, or I take it and I dry it down, I grind it, and I can tell if you have vomitoxin, which heard of vomitoxin or DON, right? Yep. If you have vomitoxin on your farm in that corn silage, with this machine, I can, after I grind it down and prepare it, I can tell you what your levels are in 3 minutes. Which this new technology is just amazing how accurate it is, how close it is to the more sophisticated things. I can look at zearalenone, I can look at vomitoxin, we can look at T2, we can look at different things, and you can do it on farm. I can actually check your stuff in your milk house or on the tailgate of my truck. I can plug it in and just do it right on the back of my truck. So the technology is there, and there's a lot of technology that's there. A quick lesson, people use the word mold and mycotoxin together, and that's not correct. Even though I thought it was correct. I did nutrition for a long time, and I didn't differentiate between the two typically. So if we step out of here, which I better not see a skunk running around here, but if we see a skunk and we don't bother him, is he going to spray you typically? If you chase him with a shovel or a stick or a broom, is he more likely to get you? Or you take your Jack Russell and have your Jack Russell go do the job for you. He comes back, you put him in ketchup or tomato juice or whatever you do to dogs. But you stress out a skunk, he releases a secondary metabolite. So in other words, you stress him out, he sprays you. Molds, you stress out a mold, they release mycotoxins. It's their defense mechanism. It's their secondary metabolite. It's a little more difficult than that, but it's pretty similar to that actually. Because if that mold feels like it's being outcompeted by something else, if it feels that it's being stressed, it's going to release that mycotoxin to defend itself. That's as easy as it is, and to me, this is a real critical part to that because I can see the moldiest corn in the world. Dave and I, we were on a farm together, and he sent me a sample with the ears, and you're like, oh my gosh, this stuff's going to be ugly. And it comes back, and it was relatively clean. It was moldy. There was a high mold count, but there wasn't a high mycotoxin count. Then there's farms that I can go to where you don't find a stitch of mold anywhere, and the mycotoxin levels are really high. And another preconceived notion that I think people have with mycotoxins is it's only an ear issue. If I have ear rot, earworm, bird damage, it's all in the ear. But if you take the ear and rip the ear off and send the stalk in and the ear in, you're going to see a lot of times as much vomitoxin in the stalk and zearalenone in the stalk as you do in the ear, and oftentimes you'll see more. When it silks, when we tassel in the summer and those silks are sticky, it's to obviously catch pollen, to pollinate, but also all these mold spores are just floating around and they're sticking right onto those silks. And what happens is if we get a lot of wind damage or wind or rain, basically that silk channel, those molds are going to get put down and you'll get silk channel infection throughout the plant. And when that happens, it's going to be in the plant. So it's kind of a combination of both. So we'll skip out of that. People come up and ask me about the difference between colors of mycotoxin. Here, look at this color. What do you think it is? It's really hard to tell that. The pinks are typically, and the whites are typically going to be Fusariums. There's going to be mucor that's on baleage or haylage or drier haylage. It's that white stuff that wasn't there yesterday, but there is there today. It's usually kind of at the top of the bunk. You'll find it in drier stuff a lot of times. Different, that doesn't cause mycotoxins. Penicilliums are really bad. They're that pretty bluish purple color that we find a lot of times in chunks. Penicillium, think of penicillin. That's typically where it comes from. So when you look at this, that's a bad one too because it causes gut health issues. Aflatoxin is this yellow-green. We really don't have it much up here. It's mostly a southern thing. You don't see it much up here at all, except you see it from Herkimer to Albany. There's a patch where you see it on farms. But it's just different environment there. So skip past that. Skip past this. So this is important, and it's something that people don't talk about much. And so you need a host, you need the mold, you need temperature, and you need water, moisture. Heavy dew, a heavy dew morning. We know how we all have some of those fields that are just dewy and wet, and you don't want to even go in the field till it's noon or 1. We have those types. But moisture, heat are really important to this. So if you look at vomitoxin right here, it needs to be basically between 60 and 80 degrees, 60 to 85 degrees, and it needs moisture. So think about where we live. We're in the Finger Lakes, and do we get 60 to 80 degrees most of the time? And do we get moisture? So you see that. So we're a little more prone to have that. You start looking at T2s and zearalenone, which are more or less known. They're not FDA regulated, but if you want to not have cows that breed, or you want to have cystic heifers, how many people have heifers that, if you have heifers that all of a sudden are aborting or are cystic and they're not sticking, we know that there's typically something wrong, but we don't pay attention to it until it gets to be the 10th or 15th heifer, or the 4th or 5th heifer. Then we start looking at things. So zearalenone is the reproductive mycotoxin. It has estrogenic effects. If you get enough of it in there, it's going to screw things up in the cow, and you're going to have issues unless you take care of it. And it's a silent one, but we have a lot of it this year from Route 390 to Route 81, which I think we're all there, right? Pretty much everybody in this room's probably there. We were prone this year to having zearalenone, which most people don't test. So it's one of these things where if our preg rates are down, reproduction's down, we probably should take a look at that. But it likes between 40 and 60 degrees and moisture. So I've talked about you want to get your population right and you want to get your day length right. The guys that plant too long of a day corn get into October corn that want to find better tonnage, but then what happens is it starts getting muddy, starts getting wet, starts getting hard to chop. It doesn't really start to dry down, but what happens is we know what happens with temperature. So the mold loves it between 40 and 60 degrees. It grows and it's reproductive and has a party then, because it's got moisture and it's got that temperature. And then what we do is we crash the temperature. We put it down to 35 or 38. How many 35 to 38 degree nights do we have in end of September, early October? So what we're doing is the mold's growing, we stress it. Mold, stress, it just keeps going and it gets more and more and more and accumulates. So that's why herds that plant early and chop early and use right dated day length corn for their farm don't typically have a mycotoxin issue. It's the chasers that I find that have a lot more mycotoxin, where we're trying to chase tons or chase something else. Or we get harvested like high moisture corn, snaplage, issues like that. That's because we're getting those warm days and then it cools down, warm, cools down, warm, because you're just releasing mycotoxins more because you're stressing the plant. So there's a lot of issues with that, and especially with blight or other situations, any stress that you get, you're opening up the opportunity for that. This is what I call Mycotoxin Alley. It's pretty much where we live, and it's just because of the climate that we have. We're just set up for fusarium mycotoxins. Crop rotation is really important. I know crop rotation is probably pretty good in this room, but there's a lot of places where there's corn on corn on corn on corn on corn on corn on corn. And we all have fields that are like that, right? And, hopefully we don't, but we all do. I'm not going to pick on tillage. If you read any magazine about mycotoxins, they talk about, conventional tillage and going away from no-till, but honestly, I think there's too many advantages to doing no-till to worry about that. To me, I think it goes back to this crop rotation and then population and trying to inhibit or lower the stress on that individual plant. And I think there's things that we can do in season to do that. Fungicide is one as well that we can look at the opportunity. Mycotoxin levels, these aren't individual mycotoxin samples, but they're like groups that are in there. Between 34 and 36 dry matter harvest is a good time to harvest for many reasons, but things start to get a little bit crazy when you get above that range. We start accumulating mycotoxins. This was a Cornell plot from 2019, kind of hits home here. Madrid, New York, 33 dry matter average, no mycotoxins. Willsboro, over east by right on the border north, 34 dry matter. Albion up close to Lake Ontario, over by Buffalo, 36 dry matter. We start seeing a little bit more mycotoxin issues. Aurora, New York, anybody heard of Aurora? Might be a little bit down the road probably. We look at Aurora, New York, average plot here was 39.3 dry matter. And you don't have to look at the numbers, you just have to look at the dots. I like looking at dots, I don't like looking at numbers. So this shows you we had a problem there. That was the latest planted field and the first chop field. And we're comparing that to northern New York farms. So that tells you that that crop had a lot of problems that year. If you look at this is that same chart. This was from Joe Lawrence at Cornell. We work quite a bit on things like this. Growing degree days, tassel and silking was right here. See these blue lines right here? That was rain. They got rain right at the absolute wrong time. And it really, really, really caused problems on that farm. Like I said, I use technology to kind of track the health of the fields from the satellite. We can't get to every field. There's a farm we were talking about yesterday, Sean, that they have a large dairy in Connecticut. When I asked him how many corn silage fields they have, he said, I'll have to look it up. And I'm like, well, 50? And he's like, no, a little more than that. And he looks it up. He said, yeah, we got 200. 200 corn silage fields. They might be 8 to 10 acres or 12 acres, but trying to do that. And he actually went into his farm, and he went into this app on his phone, or you can see it on your computer, and it's free. And he went in and he marked all of his fields. They're already marked for you. He just had to put a name on a field, 1 to whatever, 1 to 200. And he could monitor weekly the health of his crop basically off of his phone. You could look at yours, and like I said, fields are already marked. You don't even have to do that. And you could look at yours, you could look at your neighbors, you could look at your relatives wherever they are, you could look at their corn and say, Lancaster County, yeah, right. Your corn, that corn behind the barn is really starting to get stressed, and people will lose their mind. But it can be done. And technology is still going that way. This is what harvested corn looks like. This is what frosted corn looks like. This was healthy corn. And as you can see how how rainfall and drought affects corn. You can see it get to be that lime color. You want that dark green color. And then when things go bad, they go bad. This is a plot that I thought everything happened around tassel for mycotoxins till I was wrong, which happens a lot. Ask my wife. When you look at this was 2020. Remember we had that early frost. Wasn't this year. We didn't have frost. But we had a real early frost. And we had 4 days in a row at 25, or 4 nights in a row, I should say. So I was doing a fungicide plot for a farm that in Vermont that uses BMR corn silage and corn on corn on corn on corn on corn. I said, how long has this field been in corn? He says, I don't know. Long time. And so he has a little bit of a vomitoxin issue because once you get it, there's a certain amount of this Fusarium graminearum, which is the mold that causes vomitoxin. It's there in the soil, but it's there at a certain percentage. And then you put more down and you have all this trash in the field, and last year's problem is next year's problem, unless we have a real big winter, but that still doesn't fix it. And then you start to get more of that mold that's supposed to be there at a small rate, you start getting it at a larger rate. So soil health is a real big part of this puzzle. And I think some of the work that Dave's doing to try to get soil health going, and a lot of the programs that Kings and what Tim has been promoting, I think will help get the soil back into balance. But this was done at tassel. So I took samples at tassel, 30% dry matter, and then at harvest. So this was like I said, a fungicide trial, and the fungicides are here. And we had no mycotoxins at all. So we spent all this time, and they're like, hey, how is this fungicide doing? I want to know which one to use. And I'm like, well, use the control. Because at that time, that was what we saw. So there was one that had it, but that's really nothing. 0.3 ppm is nothing for mycotoxins. So at 30 dry matter, we were around 0.2, 0.3, 0.2, very low levels of mycotoxins. I mean, you got to be over 2 parts per million in corn silage to really cause a little bit of an issue with cows, and depending on your herd stress. So this is nothing. So I thought, oh, this plot, we did all this work for nothing. We got 4 days of frost. We harvested the plot. I left, it was 31 dry matter. They chopped it, 12 days later, and we were at 50. That's not a good thing. So, what my little mycotoxin levels that I had, all of a sudden ballooned to 3 parts per million, 5 parts per million, almost 6, ballooned in 12 days. So you want to talk about plant stress, that's what happened. A 17x increase in vomitoxin levels in 12 days because we had that late season stress, the mold was there, we opened up the plant, And basically, that all happened really quick. So we need to make sure when we have issues like this, that happen, that we do what we can to have it. I'll skip over some of this stuff. Oops. These red lines are pretty much where we're at, right? Corn silage, higher risk levels. TMR, higher risk levels. Haylage, small cereal grains, not so much. I see more mycotoxins in cereal grains than I do in haylages, but I don't see that much in haylage. The only time I see it in haylage is if haylage was made pretty late. You've got a lot of grasses, and sometimes you get seed head, some seed head issues with some headed out stuff. Straw, anybody use straw in the diet? No. Straw is something we really need to monitor because how many people, okay, so we're not using straw in our diet, but how many people have, and this will be an uncommon term, but you probably understand it, how many people in here have wetted in straw? Anyone? And you know what I mean by wetting it in, right? It's kind of dry. We just make it and it's, it has that musty smell, starts to turn black. We don't like it real well. Well, there's a lot of mycotoxin issues in straw that I don't think we realize how much of an issue that is. So when I start seeing fresh cow issues on farms, one of the first things I do is I'll want to test the straw for mycotoxins because more often than not, it's this thing we ignore, but then a lot of times it's a problem that we run into. Corn obviously follows that. I'll skip over this stuff. Vomitoxin through the years from 2015 to 21, it doesn't get any better. We have waxes and wanes, but it stays pretty much the same. 100 to 90 some percent of the time we have it. So we pretty much always have it up here. Zearalenone, this is another one. It says 42 samples, but it's 150, and I don't know why that says that. So this is 2018 to 2021. This is zearalenone, which is the estrogenic mold, the mycotoxin that causes repro issues. We had problems back here, and then we didn't have the right signature to have that mold. This year, it's a party. We had a big signature for that. So there's a huge uptake, increase in zearalenone this year. For the plot, we saw 1.4, which is about average for corn silage, 1.4 to 2 in Ohio. I don't know where I'm at. In the Northeast is an average number. Sometimes you'll see it a little bit higher than that. Zearalenone, which is the repro one, that one's up this year quite a bit. I thought if the more you stress the plant, so the higher you plant a population with something that likes to be low population, you're going to stress it out and get more mycotoxins. I thought, oh, this is going to be the greatest plot in the world. But what we found is out of all the varieties, doesn't matter what the plant population was. It didn't matter what the plant necessarily was. If it was a defensive or an offensive variety, it just seemed to be a typical problem. But for our friend 43T, that was the corn silage that was 36 to 39 dry matter, the stuff that was probably a little late. And Rod and I talked about that field where it looked a little stressed. It was starting to die down. You could tell it was getting there. And it was probably a little more stressed, and it was the earliest planted corn, and seems to dry down pretty quick anyways. At 24,000, we had pretty low mycotoxin levels, but when you got to 36,000, that's when you had it. That's what I expected to see in the plot with these flexi varieties, and the same thing with zearalenone. I expected to see that increase. I did not see it, but I wonder, and probably Rod, just like you would wonder with the tonnage, would we have had more of mycotoxin issues if all the corn was at 37 to 38 dry matter? And I typically see that. As the corn gets drier, we start to get more mycotoxins. So sometimes there are situations where if I know I have a guy that has a bad mycotoxin issue in a field, I will have them chop a little bit earlier between that 32 and 35 range, because it seems to the mycotoxins kind of miss the boat a little bit, and you can kind of do that. And that'll kind of goes against my starch thing, but to me, there's a lot of things that go into it. So population-wise, no difference really between them. So it kind of shoots that theory of mine. Same thing with dry matter. We'll skip over this. Basically, this is just saying that there's a long tail to mycotoxins. When you start seeing cows where you have fresh cows that kind of go off feed a little, we all know what those cows look like. They get loose, they get sucked up a little, manure gets a little bit loose, like I said. They don't make as much milk, cold ears, sunk in eyes, they don't look great, and then they roll around and they're okay in a few days. I'd keep an eye on those situations because it could be a mycotoxin situation, and a lot of times there's a long tail with it because we don't usually figure it out till a month or so. And that immune system's getting pounded on every single day. And the one thing that I would say about vomitoxin, a lot of people don't worry about it. Sean, have you ever seen vomitoxin kill cows? Probably not. Normally it won't kill a cow, but it'll bang on the immune system enough that it'll cause problems. So there's a sticky protein, and I don't want to get too technical because I'm not very technical at all, but in the gut, you've got the gut wall, basically the leaky gut, where they talk about when you have leaky gut, basically the gut's opened up and whatever pathogens just get into the animal. Vomitoxin there's this sticky protein that holds the gut wall together, and vomitoxin reduces the protein that holds that together. So if you have salmonella, E. coli, any other negative, Clostridia, anything else, basically what happens if you've got vomitoxin on them all the time and you're not really doing something about it, it's going to open up the gut a little bit, and you're going to get those cows that would be subclinical normally with salmonella or E. coli. They just power through it. That's when you start seeing these cows that individually get it. When you see these cows, it might not be a mycotoxin issue, but it's probably an issue that just was contributed because of mycotoxins. That's kind of about it. I'm going to start doing Dave's presentation. I couldn't do Dave's presentation. You speak a different language. Any questions? Any questions about mycotoxins or anything else? I'm sorry I went through like a lot that was probably confusing at times, but.
Similar